So each night's event will be recorded, and then I will send that out as a YouTube link, hopefully within the next few days after that recording or after that event. And so tonight, but if you have any questions, probably the best way to handle the questions is to put those in the chat. We will probably, after Susan tonight and Jennifer, myself, will probably maybe talk for a little while, maybe take a little break and then talk some more. And in doing that, we may unmute and let people ask questions. But with the large group that we have, it's probably simpler to just put those questions in the chat, and then we'll try to address those and work through those. Again, I'm sharing the agenda, and so tonight we're going to talk about forage and pasture management for optimum nutrition and health of sheep and goats, and then medicine wall, and Susan Jaster is going to cover that. Next week on Monday night, Jennifer Lutz will talk about utilization of records and for optimum operation management, and then she'll give a little bit of a market outlook. And then the final evening I'll talk, and that's actually on a Tuesday, October 26th. But I'll talk about preparation for winter nutrition and management, and then as we come late winter and as we come out of winter, usually is lambing and kidding season. So I'll talk a little bit about that as well as we prepare now for that. And so that's kind of the overview of the 3 nights. Basically, like I say, if you have any questions, best place to put those is in the chat, and we'll answer those as we go through. And we're more than happy to answer questions. I think the best way to do that with this large of a group is to try to use the chat. And so with that, Susan, are you ready?
If I unmute myself, I am ready. Yes.
Yeah. I always heard this. I watch a thing. It says, turn your mic on. Well, basically that's unmuting yourself. So turn your mic. Anyway, again, this is Susan with Lincoln University Cooperative Extension. Has a very knowledgeable background in sheep and goats, raises hair sheep, and has utilized those in various management strategies. And so with that, I'll let her have the floor.
All right. Are you putting my presentation up, or am I putting that up?
If you want to do it, you can. If not, I will.
Okay.
Probably work better if you can and do that, because you can have all the management of it that way.
So if I hit the share screen, that's what I need to do, right?
Yes. Share the PowerPoint. Yes.
There it is. Okay. That. And slideshow.
And then click to go to the presenter view. There you go.
Okay. All right. And let's see. Okay. So let's get started. I'm glad to see everybody on here tonight. Lots of names I recognize and everything, but we're going to get started. And thanks for putting your location into the chat. That looks great. We have folks from everywhere. So I want to talk about resilience tonight, and that's very important to me when we look at lots of environmental situations that we might have. So do you know, or do you have resilient pastures? And is your soil biologically active? And how do you know? So this photo, I've used this in presentations before. And so if you've seen it before, sorry, but I think it's just such a good example of what's happening today and why we're seeing problems because we've done practices like this. So the X in the picture right there is simply for reference so that you can see that I'm still taking a picture of the same thing. But that large tree, there's a lot of cows under that tree, and they are all taking shade. But what else do you notice about the pasture there? It's super short. There's lots of mud around the pond water. And if you look where the cows are, you don't even see grass everywhere, especially under the shade of the tree. It's almost all mud. And that is super short grass. We don't want to see it when it's that short. It is shorter than a golf course. So that is summer of 2016. And now we're going to go to October 2020, a few short years later. Now the X is on the same tree that you saw in the last photo. And what do you notice? There's still no grass. It's very super short. There's no water in the pond anymore. And the tree is gone. The big tree that the cows were under is gone. And now there is a large, I don't even know if you can call it a rivulet anymore, because that is about 18 inches deep. That if you look in the foreground there, and there is just a cutout in the soil, and it is got a few weeds in it. And here again, that tree is gone. The farmer cut that tree down because he thought it was what sucked the water out of the pond. And so, that doesn't really happen, but maybe that's what he thought did it. There's no roots in the ground in this pasture, is there? There's no grass, so there's no roots to hold any moisture. So this paddock is really suffering from lots of problems. And now I want to update you. Here's another photo of the same place. There's our X's on our tree for reference over there. And this is a 3-inch rain event happening on that location. And not only is there lots of rainwater flooding that area, but look at the grass and notice that there is water puddling up on top of that super short grass. You can never see grass growing tall here. It's always eaten down to this level. And there's virtually nothing there for the cows to eat. And there's lots of other bad practices that go on at this place, but the main reason I wanted to show you these is because when we have short grass, we have no resilience. When we have cows all over the place, eating all the time, continuously grazing, we have no roots in the ground. There's no way to fix this but to rest it. And, if you don't rest your paddocks and your pastures, you're going to have overgrazing problems like this. This is severe overgrazing like I have seen all over the state of Missouri, plus many other states. Whenever I drive anywhere, I'm always looking at pasture and seeing what other people do and what kind of plants are in there and what kind of animals they're grazing. And overgrazing is very prevalent in the United States. We are not careful. So we need to be thinking about how can we build up resilience so that when we get flooding, these 3-inch rain events like we're going to continue to have, what can we do to keep our pasture from totally washing away? What can we do to have good grass and nutrition for our animals all the time? So this is basically what we're going to talk about tonight: pasture management, building resilience, nutrition, and maybe a medicinal wall. And I'm Susan Jaster, and I hope you'll come along on this talk with me tonight, and let's learn a few things about resilience. And we may not talk about nutrition in the traditional sense of the way, like protein and carbs and different things like that, and anything that we might talk about in animal nutrition, because we're going to mostly talk about soil health. And when you have soil health, and as you build it, you build your nutrition. And that is how we get to keep healthy animals, is because we build up our resilience, which brings along nutrition as we build. So hopefully you'll see that in a little bit. So I put this map in because this is another point to ponder on as we try to build resilience, and why we should build resilience for our soils. Because the 100th meridian is famous for, well, for many reasons, but the one I want to talk about is that this is the divide between the arid west and the humid east. And that is traditionally where you go to go west. And this line has basically moved since 1980. It's been moving for a long time, but since 1980, it's moved about 140 miles. And now it is basically at the 98th meridian. And for those of us in the Midwest, and that's getting kind of scary if you think about it. Here in Missouri, some maps even show the line over a little further, hitting the tip of the northwest tip of Missouri already. And so when you have a divide of the arid west and the humid east, basically that's your rainfall. That's the difference in rainfall from the desert to the rainforest. So the difference there is getting very close to us, and we don't want to be that close to that line, because that makes it more difficult for us to be resilient and know what's going to happen with weather. And that's why we see changing weather patterns, is because of, well, we can call it climate change or whatever you want to call it, but we're seeing changes in our weather patterns due to these kinds of shifts. Now, here's the next problem I see, and that is that tillage is the #1 enemy of soil. Now, we can go back and forth on this all night, and the more tools man has, the more he abuses soil because it's easier. But when you start learning about how not to till and use no-till practices, and start thinking about soil health, you start realizing and learning that every time you turn soil over like this, you are letting all the carbon out. That's why we have so many issues with CO2, because, well, and that's not the only reason, don't get me wrong. Everybody talks about, oh, take all the cars and trucks off the road. Well, that might help some of it, but we're still doing these practices too, as far as farming goes. Now, most people are not using moldboard plows, I hope, but the less you disturb the soil, the better off you are, the less carbon that you're gonna let out. And it's, we just have to lower our risk by not turning over the soil as deeply as this. Not only are you letting the carbon out, but you're churning up mycorrhizal communities. And it takes about 6 weeks for mycorrhizae to recolonize. So we don't want to be disturbing that system very much if we can help it. And whenever we till, we're taking the oxygen out of the soil. We're making the particle sizes smaller. And glomalin, which is what feeds the mycorrhizae, it only has a lifespan of 27 days. So the more we churn that up, the shorter that lifespan is. And if you have living roots in the soil, that's also going to feed the soil. But when we turn it over this much, it's just very damaging. Now, these maps are, I have the link right there. You can look these up. They have lots of maps on there to show the different levels of carbon dioxide emissions. I'm no expert on this, obviously, but when you start looking at the patterns, for America especially, look at the upper map is in January. And if we think of orange, pink, red, and yellow as colors that we don't want to see, in January, we don't have them. But then as we move into May, we notice that the colors are brightening and we have lots of pink, and it's going to orange and red. So what happens in May and all summer long, there's a lot of tillage going on. And we are planting and doing things, all these operations. So that is letting the carbon out of our soil. So then we get CO2 emissions. So you can look those up anytime if you like. It's on the government ePubs, and they have ePublications. So they have lots of reference maps on there. You can learn about lots of things there. And as we look at those things, then we have to think about, what can we do? What can we do to stop those problems on our farms? What can we do to build resilience? And I like this poster from Understanding Ag. They show the 6 principles of soil health. And of course, everyone has their own context. You have to think about your farm. It's unique, you're unique, and your stewardship practices are unique and should always be there to help your land be the best that it can be. And so we're always wanting to build resilience. We don't want to be efficient anymore. We want to have resilience so that if something happens, like one of these weather events that we seem to get now, it doesn't wipe out our whole crop, or it doesn't wipe out our whole farm or take all the topsoil that we have. We want to build the context of the uniqueness of our place and ourselves. So if anybody says that these principles won't work, then I would have to say they will within the context of your uniqueness. So there's ways to make all of this work on your property. First of all, we don't want to disturb it very much. In nature, there's no mechanical or chemical disturbance. So how can we go about that? Maybe we don't, if we want to remember to use tools to help us, but not to make it a rule. So if a practice that you might think about would be, maybe we always disc this one field, or we always till the garden. Well, maybe you need to figure out ways to open up your garden without using tillage, or without spraying Roundup to burn all the weeds down. So we want to think about ways that we can do the same things that we've been doing without disturbing the soil. You want to cover it and build surface armor. So how can you do that? There's lots of ways, keeping living roots in the soil all year long, using proper grazing techniques, using animal trampling to get seeds into the soil contact. And there's lots of ways to do that without ripping up the surface matter. And then mix it up. We want to always have a diversity on our pastures, because diversity brings in lots of complex solutions for us. So when we have a diverse plant life, then that helps us build up our microbes in a diverse way. It also brings in, everybody's worried about pollinators now, but it will also bring in predator bugs. So if we have a lot of diversity in our plant life and our animal life, that's going to help bring in diversity in insects. So for every, I think the number is, for every bad bug, there's like 17 good bugs. So if you have a place for pollinators to live and have and eat, then you also have a place for predator bugs to live and eat. So if you bring all the good stuff in, it's going to outnumber the bad stuff. And so that is a good way to think of your farm as never being a monoculture of any kind, always having diversity. And keep those living roots in the soil as long as possible. And if you can figure out ways to have a living root in the ground all year long, that is great. Never let a field be totally devoid of plants all winter, because there's no food for the mycorrhizae and the little critters down there to eat. So they will go down deeper in the soil and not be there in the spring when you need them to help the grass grow faster and get animals out there on the pasture faster. And also just think about using grazing and using it properly. Have our animals eat competitively and not let them do continuous grazing in the whole farm, because continuous grazing ruins like 30% of your pastures, and it also basically wipes out, as we saw in those pictures, it wipes out your any stockpile you might have for a different time of the year. So you never have a way to, you don't have nothing to fall back on. So proper grazing techniques really help us out. So those are the 6 principles of soil health. And if you want more information on that, you can go to understandingag.com. They have lots of information there for you. And these are the principles, the adaptive stewardship that goes along with that last poster. And we always need to be thinking of how we can compound things, everything we do on our farm or ranch is it's not neutral. Okay, it's either positive or negative. And when we do something, we of course want it to be positive. We want to have a good positive outcome. So if we do have to till, maybe it's only once every 4 or 5 years, or we only till one field at a time, or, you know, there's lots of ways to look at it. If you are using burning techniques, when you burn off pastures, don't do it every year, because pretty soon fire has a tendency to make your plants spread out. And so that's why when you see a lot of places that have been burned quite often, you'll start to see a lot of cedar trees and a lot of just trees in general, because the fire spreads out the grass and leaves openings for the trees to get started. Whereas if you use proper grazing techniques, then it brings the plants together and they fill in those blank spaces by themselves and keep the grass tall so that it can keep providing shade for the soil. And then disruption, there's lots of ways to do disruptions because nature kind of gets in, especially on tilled or farmed land, it will get into patterns. So if we always use the calendar to do things like, okay, March the 1st, we always do this practice. Well, pretty soon there's no incentive for those plants to grow rich and thick because something always happens at the same time. We always graze them off on March 1st because we let all the cows out. So we've got to stop doing things by the calendar because we have to go out. We need to go out and observe what's going on in our pastures and change things up. And a good way to do that is either starting at different places when we graze. You can add cover crops by broadcasting them and letting them grow there. And a lot of times whenever I use cover crops, I will broadcast them in and then put animals in so that they can graze off what's already there and trample those seeds into the ground. So that's another form of disruption. And then we want to use diversity, of course. Never have a monoculture. We always want to always have lots of different kinds of things. And so if I put a cover crop in, it's going to be a mixture of many different kinds of seeds because I want different plants, different root lengths, and different foods for my livestock. Something else you can do to help yourself build resilience on your farm. Go out and dig a hole and look at it. Look at your soil. What does it look like? And if you want to start by digging, you don't have to go crazy. You hear about soil pits now and again, and some people will go out with a track hoe and just dig a great big hole and see where the roots are. How deep are they? But you don't have to get that crazy. You can go dig an 8x8 hole in the ground and see just about enough to know what you've got. You want to look in there and see how many earthworms you have. You want to look at the texture of the soil. And your soil should look like chocolate cake, like in that picture to the right. It's showing just basically a little cutaway of the soil, and they're showing the roots, how well they go down. You can see the texture of the soil, and there's a lot of things to look at in there. You can compare plants from one side of the hole to the other. What do they look like? And I would do a couple of those, do one in a great place in your farm, and then do one in a not so great place, so that you know the difference. And then get a soil health test. And by name, that is called the Haney test. And that will tell you lots of things. Active carbon is a really important one. Potentially mineralizable nitrogen, not easy to say. And then there's a few other things that go along with that. It'll tell you about the pH of your soil, whether it's in water or low acids and things like that. So you can get a lot of information from the Haney test. It's usually not very expensive. You can add on lots of other tests to that, of course, but that would give you a baseline on how your active carbon is and how far you need to go to help your soil to become healthy. And I know there's several people on here tonight that are already using the Haney test. And if you are using it and you know what your active carbon is, put that in the chat box if you don't mind.
Susan,
Yes.
where would one go to get a Haney test?
Well, you can get them at most, maybe not most, but you can get them at soil labs. And a Haney test, you just collect the soil at about 3 to 6 inch depth, and then take a cross section of your pastures and just mix those all together and send in about 2 cups of soil into the soil lab. And you can look online for any soil lab and basically ask them if they do the Haney test. And the other place that you can get a similar test, and it's not the full Haney test, is at the MU Soil Health Analysis Lab. And if you'll just look up Soil Health Analysis Lab, then you should be able to, MU's lab should come up on there, and there should be several others. But the Haney test will tell you a lot of things, and the MU test is not the full Haney test, but it gives you enough information to do what you need to do. That's the one I use for any of my projects right now. Does that answer the question? If you need more suggestions on that, you can always contact me. I will help you find a place to do the Haney test.
Thanks, Susan.
So another thing you could do to build up resilience is to plant those cover crops. And when you do that, you're going to help sequester lots and lots of carbon. Now here's that same picture. And there's a lot of different kinds of plants in there. And if you look at the pink arrow there, I believe that's millet. The purple arrow is pointing at the sun hemp. And the blue arrow is showing that there are some hay beans down in there, which is just a real leafy version of soybeans. And there's there's some little sunflowers if you really look, and there's maybe some sorghum Sudan. There's lots of different kinds of plants in there. There's like weeds, if you want to call them that. My sheep would love to be in this pasture. But look at the variations in height of those plants. I mean, if you go way down and look at the poor little hay bean down there, he's doing a lot for us. He's probably fixing some nitrogen. The sun hemp in all its glory there is that at the very least is helping our pollinators. And that would be a specific kind of a pollinator because of the bell flower on that. That's going to be a smaller than, sometimes honeybees can get in there, but smaller pollinators can get into those types of flowers, which is a good thing to have habitat and food for them. I believe there's some sunflowers in this picture too. They're kind of have their heads turned down. They're harder to see, but sunflowers can do a lot for us too. And ruminants really love to eat all parts of the sunflower. So when you have cover crops, you can feed lots of the diversity that you are hoping to draw. Now, what can those cover crops do? They can help us change patterns of growth, and they can brighten the communications between plants, because now there's some other types of plants growing in between the grass and the weeds that we already have, because I don't ever want to destroy a sod. If it's already there, I'm going to broadcast into it. And don't have a heart attack. You won't see a lot of your cover crop at first. It's there, it's working. You just don't see it. And after about the 3rd planting, there'll be more of the cover crop showing. And I usually plant spring and fall, and I plant early spring for summer grazing, and I plant late summer for winter grazing, for late fall and winter grazing. So if you do that twice a year, just to kind of open up your pastures, then it'll help stir up the life that's in the soil, and we'll get that biology functioning and help it bring up nutrients from deep down in the soil. And that's what you're trying to do by using lots of mixtures of cover crops. You're trying to bring up different nutrients from different places in the soil. So you're mining those nutrients up from lots of different places. Cover crops can also bolster your winter stockpile. And when I plant cover crops, I try and do a ratio of 1 to 1 to 1. And that's grass, forbs, and legumes. So we want to have a good mixture of those three things. And then, of course, it has to be in your context. So if you're way out west, you're not going to plant oats and rye with turnips and radishes probably, because it may not survive your winter out there. But in the Midwest, we can use that as a cover crop mixture for the fall. So always think of what are your goals and what season are you planting it for? Will you be grazing it? And do you need other things like weed suppression or nitrogen mining and other nutrients? Because if you will, there's cover crops for everything. And we want to use them purposefully. If you have a good cover crop distributor, I would go in with my goals, when I want to graze it, how much I can spend per acre, and how many acres I would like to cover. And I would also tell them that I'm broadcasting this over the top of perennial pastures. So that is my set of goals and my purpose. But you can always use other kinds of cover crops to do different jobs. So if you are gardening, you can look for cover crops that will fit into a gardening situation or a vegetable situation. So always look for, build your context and have your goals and then know what season it's for. So that does help a lot. So now let's talk about grazing and proper grazing technique and why that's important. And I'm sorry I have to keep taking drinks. I'm in the middle of COVID, so this is my second week of COVID. So I thought I needed a little more moisture in my throat. But anyway, let's talk about grazing. And this is a picture I took when I was at Greg Judy's farm. He is a farmer here in Missouri, closer to St. Louis. And he never lets his cattle eat more than the top 1/3 of the plant. Now, why would he do something crazy like that and leave all these tall plants in the pasture? Well, that's really the way it should look. Those cows should always be belly deep in grass. And when I have sheep and goats out, he has goats and sheep as well, and he does the same thing. It's always super tall. And when I graze my sheep, I try and always put them into really deep stuff. Sometimes you can't see them in there because it's so tall. But they will eat that down. And the longer you leave them in there, the shorter it's going to get, obviously. But the new growth is in the top 1/3 of the plant. So in the growing season, we only want them to nip off that top 1/3 so that the plant has enough energy to regenerate itself very quickly. Because if you don't have leaves on the plant, it is not collecting energy, and then it's not producing all the vital fluids that it should to feed the soil and feed the mycorrhizae and feed all the other things that it should feed. I threw this one in here. This is not in your slides. But I threw this in here to show how important diversity is. You can get a lot of nutrients out of all those different plants that are in there. The one that looks like a tiny clover is black medic, and it is super rich in nutrients. It is a legume. It is a medicinal as well. And then you have lots of grasses and other things in there. But when I talk about diversity in a pasture, I want to see at least this much diversity. And to me, that's just getting started. So that's why a lot of times I'll add cover crops in to make that pasture bring up different seeds from the past. And so quite often, once you get pastures to this density and this much diversity, it will start bringing up warm season grasses all on its own. There will be plants in there that have not been seen on the farm for years, once your soil nutrients are functioning. So diversity is very important. Oh, I went too far. So when we talk about grazing, we want to be really careful because we don't want to graze down here at this red line, because what happens? You're going to see lots of problems if you always keep it that short, because there's no roots. They slough off once the plant is like 3 inches tall. It stops producing any kind of glomalin, and glomalin is the food for the mycorrhizae. That is the sticky substance that coats the roots, and that is where the mycorrhizae live and eat. And then the mycorrhizae, as a courtesy to the plant, not courtesy, it's a symbiotic relationship, the mycorrhizae go and farm for the plant. They bring food and water and make sure that plant is happy, because it is providing the mycorrhizae with housing and its food. So there's a symbiotic relationship that we want to keep going. But if you have that plant at 3 inches or shorter, it cannot produce glomalin. So the roots are going to slough off because there's no leaves above that are collecting solar energy. So there's no photosynthesis, there's no sugars being made. There's a lot of disruption there. Plus, when you get that short, what else happens? The parasites can work their way up that stem, and now there's nothing left but these short little stems. The cows are going to eat that, and the sheep and goats are going to eat that if you leave them in there. So they're eating back their parasites. Another thing that happens, there's no shade canopy from the tall grass. Soil temperatures are going to be higher. I've told this story many times before. It's, in October, I think it was October or November one time, I was out with a group of women. We were on a conference looking at this pasture, and I knew we were going to be there. I took a temperature. The grass that was super short by the gravel driveway was 30 degrees higher on a cold day. We all had our hoods and jackets on, and it was cold, but it was 30 degrees hotter there in that short grass than it was in the grass that was 6 to 8 inches tall. So the canopy is important, whether it's winter or summer. It is protecting our soil and keeping our soil temperatures at that great temperature for our earthworms and our soil microbes. They like to be in that 55 to 65 degrees. And so if there's a shade canopy of plants over the top of the soil, then our little subterranean critters stay closer to the surface and help us by staying there and keep working while even while there's weather events, because they have food to eat. They have a place to live. So when you see a bare field after they've cut corn or beans off of it and they leave it like that all winter, there's no food for those microbes. And they're just going to go down deeper, and they won't be there to keep our soil biologically active. And we're also learning now that when we cut plants this short, the communications between plants ceases. So mostly because the mycorrhizae don't have a place to live, because they do most of the communicating or a lot of it. So plants can't send out a signal, oh, this bug is eating me. Help me send out chemical pheromones to maybe make the bugs go away. So plants need to communicate, and it's important to have enough of a plant left so that it can produce all these wonderful things that it does. And also, when you cut the grass that short, or any plant that short, the seed production is going to be lower automatically. So nature cannot defend you if you have no active biology. So now let's talk about grazing high. You get free eco services with this. Plants remain in a vegetative state. They will continue to be green. There's leaves to collect sunlight. So photosynthesis is happening. We've got, the animals are more likely going to graze those higher leaves first, so that they're going to graze some of the plant leaves, and then that helps the plant to keep growing. But it also, every time we stress out the plant by biting off a leaf, then it sends a signal to the plant and the roots to work harder to bolster the nutrients in there. And so the plant gets stronger. So, and when we also, the another thing is that when we graze it high like this, we can still have a good Brix level. That is the sweetness of the plant to the animal. We can still have a good Brix level because the plant is not so short that it's not producing sugar. And so basically it's still a desirable plant, even if it's not the most nutritious plant. It's still, they're still going to eat it because it has some good things there. I'm kind of working myself into a hole there, sorry. But we don't want it to, we want it to always be vegetative. So there's producing the good things inside with photosynthesis. And when you cut it at this height, it is not going to slough off all the roots. So that way that keeps the plant stable as well. And it's also providing shade so that our critters have a good temperature to live in the soil. So just remember that plants with leaves are collecting solar energy. If they don't have any leaves, it's not collecting energy. And a good 2-foot tall plant can have anywhere from 2 to 10 feet of roots and maybe more. And then in order to keep it resilient, we do have to rest the paddock or the pasture. So when the top 1/3 of the plants are gone, and this is grazing knowledge that you have to grow into. Let me just backtrack a little bit on that. When you first start grazing, it's hard to understand how much is enough residual. So if you go out and look at your plants and you say, I'm going to leave 8 inches of residual grass. Okay, 8 inches is a good number. And there's still shade on the ground and it's still producing glomalin and all that. But as you progress, you're going to realize the bigger the plant is, the easier it is for it to grow back. And so as you progress, and I've had to make myself do this over the years, is look at the plant, and NRCS will tell you take half, leave half. Well, what does that mean? You have to go out there and measure it sometimes so that you know, because all the plants are different heights. So try and get an average so that you know what is half. And then when you get to be really good at it, like Greg Judy is, then you're going to only take that top third. So don't freak out. Don't worry that you might mess it up. This is very forgiving. This whole system is very forgiving, but you have to let it rest once you take the cows off. So when you make your mind up, what is the height of this plant? What am I going to leave as residual? And I'm going to take the animals off at that point. And once you start learning to look for that, it's a lot easier to know, oh, tomorrow we're going to be to that point. We're going to need to move cows, move sheep, and get them into the next paddock. So you got to be prepared for that. So this is the complicated part of grazing and moving animals, is you have to train your eye to know when to stop, when to move them. And then in the growing season, it might only take 30 days for that to grow back. That's in the warm part of the year. So when it gets to be hotter or colder, it's going to take longer. So maybe you don't know exactly when that might be, but you want it to be when all the tips are grown back onto the grass. So a bite mark in a blade of grass should be a little squiggly line across the blade of the grass. It's not going to be real straight across there like it would be with a mower or a blade. But once it grows back, it has to grow out to a point. So that's how you know it's ready to be grazed again. And not just one blade, you have to go look through the pasture a few feet in to see if they're all grown back. So be mindful of that.
Susan,
Yes.
we had a question in the chat. Is there a difference in rest periods between annual pastures or perennial pastures? Do we treat them differently?
You still need to go out and observe, obviously. And yeah, because an annual pasture, and Josh Payne's on here tonight, I think. He does a lot of annuals in his cover crops. It's more, you're going to look at it, how is it planted, or is it just wild annuals? So if it's planted, of course, that could terminate the plants if you graze them too hard, but that may be your point. That may be part of your goal, is to terminate that plant with grazing. So obviously, you're going to have to look at that differently, because you're not going to regrow it. You're going to plant something else in there. So, and I'm sorry about that. I thought I had my phone on silent, but yeah, you're going to have to look at it a little differently, but you also need to think about what are your goals for that, for those annuals or those perennials. Does that answer it?
Yeah, I think so. So I think they were asking if there's a different rest period. So, you're talking about 30 to 60 days to allow these permanent pastures to grow back.
Right. And if you're planting annuals in a cover,
And then,
that's going to be different. So what are your goals? Go ahead.
and then we had one other quick question. The plant that you named earlier it was a small, low growing legume. You said it was kind of like a clover. Hay beans. Is it bitter something or other?
Sun hemp
It-
was the other one.
No, it was low growing. It was short. It was in your 4 grid slide. Black medic. That was
Black
it.
medic.
Yep.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Thank you. Thank
That's
you.
it. Right there, black medic, yeah. That is, can you see my arrow? There's the black medic. Right there.
Yes.
That little clover looking plant.
Thank you. Sorry to interrupt.
No, that's okay. Glad somebody's asking questions. All right, so and we're still talking about resilience, and I'm hoping that you're seeing that as these plants get healthier and healthier because we have more nutrients in the soil, that you're going to have more nutrients in the plant, because as the soil is biologically active, basically it's feeding all those plants and they're more available for plant uptake. So as you build resilience, you are basically bringing up lots of nutrients that are available to the plants, and the plants can bring into themselves to make themselves healthier. So basically, your animals are going to be healthier, their nutrition is going to be up, and because the plants are so healthy. And then as we talk about resilience, I also like to talk about risk management, and how that helps us build resilience is that we're not causing problems for anybody else, and we are basically not trespassing on anyone. So if it can, anything that rains on or falls on, crawls on, sprays on, or grows on your farm should remain there until harvest or being sold, because you need to be preventing problems for other people. So if your soil is healthy, it's going to have a higher moisture absorbency, and it can keep from having, you will keep from having runoff. If your animals are well fed, they're not going to try and go over the fence to the neighbors because the good grass is here. And if we're not spraying synthetics, then we're not going to have chemical trespass. But if we grow good grass and trees all around, that's going to prevent trespass from leaving our borders, or chemical from leaving our borders to trespass. So I'm hoping you're not using too many chemicals, but if we are using some risk management, we're growing more grass and trees, then our soil's pretty healthy, and we won't have too many risk problems. Also, I talked about bringing in predator insects. That also, when you have a diversity of plant life, you're also not going to get as many plant diseases. The threshold is much higher, and you don't get as many with really super healthy plants. So then the minute you have a monoculture, you're inviting in disease, because now you have one plant, the disease likes that plant, and it can spread to a lot of plants. So if you have diversity, you're not going to see as high a pressure from diseases as well. And I threw that in there just to kind of break things up. I like seeing lots of little plants like that, but I always want to see, where are the roots? What do they look like? And I hope they look better than that drawing, but that's what I want to see. It spread out and communicating and having good nourishment. So that brings me to, I promised a medicinal wall or a medicinal hedge. And, when you think of a hedge, what do you think of? You think of a wall of bushes maybe. Or maybe if you think of a medicinal hedgerow, you might think of this other picture here. And there's a lot of herbs in there that could be considered medicinal. Quite a few of those are, in fact, I think all of those are medicinal. But what do we really mean? Now, I got this idea from a lady I met at a conference, and she is from Greenville, South Carolina, and her farm is Pecondale Farm. I believe her name was Kirsten Robertson. And she claimed, and I haven't done this yet, she claimed that having a medicinal hedge basically helped her dismantle her deworming program for her small ruminants. So now that's claiming a lot, and I know that, but if your soil is healthy, you're probably going to be heading in that direction where you will not need as much chemical dewormer as you had in the past. Now, saying that, you're going to need to learn how to do that. And I believe the way she put it, that she used a lot of different plants. She fenced them in with stock panels, and then the sheep could only reach, or the goats could only reach, the parts of the plant that grew out through the stock panel. So she used things like willow and willow trees, black locust or honey locust trees. She had oak trees, and then she had lots of things like berries, like brambles, because those are rich in tannins as well as the tree bark. But she also added herbs and other little plants that are considered medicinal. So you can put any plant or tree in there, but after a while, you're going to see this tree is going to grow a lot bigger, right? So what she has been doing is coppicing the trees. So that means you cut it down short and let it grow out sprouts, and just every year you cut back that tree so that it grows more fine sprouts. And so when you do that, that keeps the tree smaller, and it is more edible and reachable by small ruminants, and they can self-medicate. And they can also do that with all of these herbs. So if we have echinacea and dandelion and other different herbs, then you can use, the animals will use them medicinally. Now, if that sounds like a lot of work, she had several of these medicinal hedges in her different paddocks, because she just had grass growing and she did not want to have anything but grass growing in her paddocks. So basically the animals needed other nutrients. And as she introduced these medicinal hedge rows or medicinal walls, the animals would flock to that spot, eat all the branches that and leaves and everything that was sticking out past the stock panel fence, and they would just go around and eat the leaves off of stuff. And so basically they were self-medicating. So I like the idea. I think it could be possibly a lot of extra work, because now you're going to have to be a horticulturalist and go out and prune these trees every year, but it could serve lots of purposes. Hopefully nobody will get stuck in the fence because they're sticking their head in too far. But you could do this in other ways, I think, that could suffice. So another way would be to half fell a tree. So basically you cut the tree so that it falls over, but you don't cut it off. You let it lean over and let it's still alive because it still has roots in the ground. It's not cut off from the roots. So the tree will basically lay over to the side and animals can get in there and eat the leaves off. And then it'll grow back because it's still a mature tree, and it will bring the leaves back on possibly before the end of the growing season. And animals love that too. So you could also plant other things around that and, you know, make it pretty easy on yourself. But you can use a lot of other techniques like coppicing, and that it's very effective. It's a very good resource of or source of tannins for your animals, because they can peel the bark off the trees then when it's a young sapling branch like that. And there's lots of other plants you can plant around it. So elderberry and echinacea, those are all good ones to add around maybe a half-felled tree, but you can also coppice the trees and get the same thing done. But now I want to remind you and warn you to watch out for fruit trees. Some trees like cherry especially are very poisonous if the leaf is wilted. So if the branch gets partially broken off and the leaf wilts and they eat it while it's wilted and not, while it's wilting, that's when it starts holding the poison in. So you want to not let animals in there. It's just best not to have cherry trees around livestock, and anything that has a stone pit like a cherry. Once the leaves are dry, they are not poisonous anymore, but just be careful of any plant that you might add, because you want to make sure that they're not highly toxic. So I think a medicinal wall could work, or a medicinal hedge, but I think it has to fit into your operation. And as animals are healthier, just because they're getting more nutrients from a deep variety and diversity of plants, they're going to be healthier, and you're not going to have to worry about these problems. And I think you'll lower your parasite load as long as you keep your grasses tall. So here are my resources, and you can see those at any time. I hope you'll look some of those up and use them. Also, I have quite a few books that I like to reference. I'm reading right now For the Love of Soil, and that is by Nicole Master. I can't seem to get that on the camera very good there. Also, another one is The Living Soil Handbook. That is a good one. That's by Jessie Frost. And also the SARE publication, Building Better Soils for Better Crops. And also, this is probably my most favorite, Managing Cover Crops Profitably. If you go to page 66 in there, that's where all the charts are for the cover crops that will tell you what the cover crops do. And you can get any SARE publication, SARE.org. You can download them for free, or you can buy a hard copy like this. So that is my talk. I know I rambled a long time. Do we have more questions?
There is another question in the chat. How do you balance out haying for winter feeding when you're establishing, how do you balance that with the grazing and cover crops and soil health?
Okay, that's a really good question. So how I started doing that, and I'm still not very good at using hay because I don't want to use hay. And so I started with the goal in mind of, I'm going to try to not have to have hay. I want to always be thinking about how I'm going to have grass in front of my animals all the time. Grass, weeds, any kind of pasture in front of them year round. So I started with that goal in mind because I hate feeding hay, and I have to do all my own labor, so I really hate it. But to balance it out, okay, yeah, if you don't have enough grass in front of them for the winter, you're going to have some hay. So try and get hay that is from the same kinds of pastures that you graze. So sometimes when you're feeding sheep and goats, and somebody's baling what they call trash hay, there's a lot, that means there's probably a lot of weeds in it. You're probably going to do really well on that. And I try and know what's in my hay. If you can get a lot of clover, even like 30% clover in it, that's a very good hay. And as long as it's not bleached out white, where it's been, where it's sat and dried too long, or if it's too old, the nutrients are always going down the longer you keep it. So the kind of hay that you're going to eat, you would eat on pasture,
I think we lost Susan. Jennifer, you.
That's hard. I think Patrick had some troubles. That's hard because, we do have years that we struggle to find hay, to purchase hay, especially if it's a drought year, and we may have to pull that in from further away. But in general, if we're producing hay, then, that ground is also not being used to graze, because those animals have to be off that ground to hay it.
right. And when they hay, I hope people, when they hay their grass, they're leaving a high residual too. Don't cut it all the way to the ground when you're cutting it for hay. You do the same practices when you're cutting for hay as you do for grazing. Leave a residual. It'll come back way faster.
Mm-hmm. There's another question in the chat. So talking about grazing pastures this time of year for goats, struggling because there's not many weeds in the pasture coming out of summer, but there's a lot of young grasses like fescue that goats don't generally prefer.
Right.
So how can we manage that?
Yeah. The more you graze, the more you will find out that the more residual you leave, the better off you are. And I know that sounds kind of like I'm not answering the question, but your grass will improve with correct grazing, with good adaptive grazing. And I'm to the point, I'm 5 years in on regenerative practices here with pastures, and I'm seeing a fourth grazing in very small paddocks. And it just gets to be easier and easier because the grass comes back better, and it brings up grass and seeds from in the seed bank that you didn't plant. So you're going to have taller stuff. The more you do this, the more variety of plants you're going to get, even though you don't plant them. You're going to find that grazing just really does amazing things for the soil and for the plants. And so if you're not finding what you want out there at this time of the year for goats like to eat with their head up. So we need to be planting that cover crop in Missouri, in northern Missouri. I find that the best place to plant, best time to plant cover crops for fall and winter grazing is going to be August 15th to about September 15th. And that's not always what they're going to tell you at the NRCS office. And they also don't want you to plant it in on top of perennials. So you may have to go outside of the norm here, and you may have to pay for it yourself and do it the way you need to do it so that you have tall things for your animals in the fall. And there are winter hardy things. There are grasses there, you know, that will hold up to fall and winter grazing. So I think cover crops is a good answer in the short term and will help you see that you have other possibilities coming up from the soil bank, from the seed bank. Does that answer that question? And I guess I can read the chat.
Sorry.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
I think that does cover that question. You know, one of the things that I find too is that oftentimes here in Missouri, we have kind of a summer drought. It's not uncommon to maybe pull your animals off the pastures during that so they're not overgrazing, supplemental feed them during that time until the rains turn back on and we've got some growth going again. Patty recommended attending grazing school. For those who may not know, in Missouri, we offer grazing schools, and it's a partnership with NRCS and the University of Missouri Extension, or the Missouri Grasslands Council. And those grazing schools really offer an opportunity to learn about rotational grazing and soil health and maintaining that forage height at all times and things like that. It's not quite to what Susan was talking about tonight. I think they recommend about a 4-inch height residual on all our grasses, depending on the time of year. But those are other opportunities too, to learn about some different grazing behaviors.
That would also be depending on the grass too.
Right, right.
Because your warm seasons, your natives and stuff, you need a lot. You need more height to them than your cool seasons, and even some of your warm seasons, you can take down a little shorter. But yeah.
But here again, it's context. You know, we can't just use this general rule of, you know, always this. And I think I'm looking at Rebecca Vineyard's statement here, and she said, well, you know, these dates may work for you, but it's so dry. Well, the thing of it is, that was my problem when I first started all this. But I've been doing these regenerative practices now for 5 years, and I started seeing a difference in the 3rd year. And we did have a drought then. And we were just amazed at how differently the pasture held. The moisture stayed there. And because we were leaving high residuals and not grazing it down too short. And we had lots of roots in the ground. We had a continuous living cover. There was plants there all the time. So that preserved my moisture level. And I was about the only green spot for lots of acres, because everybody else was not using regenerative practices, and they were drying out. So as you get into this, it will work for you. It will build moisture. It will hold moisture. And I think, and then just sprinkle that clover seed out there on top of the snow. And I usually wait for the snow to be starting to get on the melty side. You know, when it's going to start melting pretty good, then you put your clover seed out. And so that can be anytime in Missouri by February, January or February, you can go ahead and put that clover seed out. And as the snow melts, it'll pull that seed down to the soil for soil contact. Now, if you're a little more brave and you want to get started, about the end of February, first part of March, when you got a little dry spell in there, usually we have, time when it's not too mushy out. And I don't worry too much about freezing. It does help if it's not going to freeze as much, but you can put some pretty winter hardy stuff out there. But I also, try and plant my summer mix probably anytime after February. So the end of February on into March. If it's going to be raining a lot, it's hard to get out there, but yeah, if I want something for summertime, I'm going to plant it in the spring, early to mid-spring. And then you do have something working for you and mining those nutrients up and holding moisture all summer long.
There's another question. What type of mix are you putting in for summer stuff that you can plant in February?
Oh boy.
What are some of those winter hardy seeds that we could plant in February for summer forage?
You can put peas in, sorghum Sudan, and your guy might not want to sell you that in the spring too soon, but you can put in cereal rye, wheat, spring oats. You can even put corn out there. And then I usually put some other, possibly some flowering plants too. Sunflowers. They won't all make it, but quite a few of them will. But peas are pretty hardy. You can even put Austrian winter peas out at that time. And they won't like it as well, but they will start and they will give you another root in the ground. And it's one thing. So here again, context and diversity are super important. So if you have an inexperienced animal on a very wide open kind of pasture, you could have problems. Now, if you have animals that come from grazing stock and are, that's been their whole life, they always graze, they're all grass fed, then they're going to know how to select plants, even though there might be a level of toxicity in them. They know how to moderate what they eat. Animals, once they're a good grazer, the animals have receptors all over their body, and especially in their head. Sheep and goats are really well known for this, that they will, if they graze something and they don't know what it is, it's an unfamiliar food, they will taste it and then they will go let it ruminate and they will chew it again in their cud. And that's when they decide if they're going back to eat any more of that. So if they get a bellyache from it, they will not go back and eat it. And I believe in my reference, in my resources, there is a talk from Dr. Daryl Emick, and he really talks, tells you about these receptors. It's pretty cool how much a grazing animal knows just by smell and taste. So you do have to be careful.
And do you recommend putting any like Cerisa lespedeza or that type of thing into the mixes?
I have only been brave enough in the recent last year. So if you have a good, strong diversity already in your pasture, then I think you can get away with it not being invasive as long as you still use good grazing techniques. But if it's already there in sprigs and like around the edges, I don't think I would add anymore because it can get out of hand, especially if you goof up one time. It can get away from you. But it's a good plant. I mean, it's super nutritious. So, how brave are you? Are you ready to try something like that? But there's nothing wrong with it. In the South, they use it all the time. We are just not as, we just don't like it because it gets kind of woody as it gets older. And if you're not grazing it hard and you don't have animals that are used to it grazing it, it can get out of hand.